They said the war would begin like a storm rolling in from a horizon no one had marked. Not because the sensors failed, but because people had learned to stop looking where the sky always looked the same. And it was true enough, though Commander Mara would later say that what came over the curve of the Perseid shelf did not move like thunder at all. It moved like fog breathing. A slow inhale that made the radio hiss and the panels hum, in a way the engineers tried to hide by tapping with the backs of their knuckles. A sound like rain on a tin roof far away, and in the quiet bridge of the nightjar, everyone lifted their heads as one creature, and listened to the beginning as if listening could change it, which it never does. And yet it is human to listen anyway. The nightjar was a small ship with more stories than mass. A courier refitted 3 times and painted twice. A vessel that had learned how to be a dozen things it had never intended to be, which is the way of old boats and old people, and the kind of units that last in any war. Because the nightjar was quietly nothing in the Concord's registry, she was a harmless bird that knew the dust lanes and refueled from forgotten drums, and had an oven that always smelled faintly of cinnamon, because someone once spilled spice in a bulkhead seam, which is to say that on paper she was nobody. And when the old Empire's scouts, the long-armed Virnai, with their eyes polished like river stones, and their way of counting the future by closing a second inner lid and humming, when these connoisseurs of triumph scanned the lines of battle for a rival worthy of their doctrine, they did not see the nightjar at all, because she had perfected the first step of the sleeper doctrine before her crew even learned the phrase, "Look harmless." Mara sat in the chair that was never called a throne because no one on her ship spoke that way, and she kept her hands resting on the arms lightly, as if waiting to catch a child leaping from a low wall, and she breathed the way the old flight instructors had taught, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and she watched the boards move from greens to winter colors, and she did not give the order to power weapons because the nightjar had none to speak of, not in the way the Virnai named weapons, only tools and arrays that could be coaxed into doing inefficient and sometimes beautiful things. And her navigation officer, Lynn, who came from a coast where storms taught people humility and ropecraft, glanced over Sant's urgency and said, like a person mentioning that tea had steeped long enough, "We have the first of their forward pickets on the scope, ma'am." "Let them arrive," Mara said, quiet and patient, the syllables low and round like river stones themselves, because for years the humans had practiced the second movement of the sleeper doctrine as if tuning a modest instrument. Become weather, which meant you do not rush to strike. You let the room fill with your presence as a fog fills a field, making the world smaller but also closer. And you teach the other side's shoulders to lower when you walk in. And this requires a certain softness that is not weakness but attention turned inward, a willingness to fold until the time comes to unfold. And because most empires imagine that softness is an apology for being alive, humanity found a little room to breathe where others kept running. The Virnai were older than the newest human myths by a factor of centuries, a kind of aristocracy of endured winters, who had learned to carry hunger as a badge and patience as a blade, and in their liturgies of war they described their fleets as gardens, careful, pruned, and inevitable. For the galaxy is full of peoples whose first metaphors are knives, and the second, gardens, and the third, music, and the Nightjar's crew had read the redacted versions of those texts, and found the wholes charming, the way a sweater worn too long has a favorite fray where a finger can worry without ending the garment, and when the first Virnai picket slid along the edge of human space, broadcasting the courteous threats of old conquerors like a well-practiced aria, Mara said, "Acknowledge," and her comms tech Arzu, who kept her hair in a braid that made a small river down her back, acknowledged in tones so even and polite that an unkind person would have mistaken them for dullness, which was step 3 in a very old play about being overlooked until it helped. The Concord's admirals were busy drawing lines on maps that curved with gravity and budget, and it was not their fault that none of those lines passed through the nightjar. But Mira, the admiral assigned to the Perseid sector, had once eaten stew at Mara's table and learned the names of 3 engineers and an old mechanic who spoke to the ship as if it were a shy animal, and from that afternoon forward, she had included the nightjar in orders meant for heavier things, confident that a small, polite vessel could hold a door longer than any doctrine said it should. And when the second message came, "Hold the flank," Keep the channels feeling safe, be seen but not, and if you are compelled to run, run in a direction that looks like an accident. Love, not fear. Mara read it twice and placed it under a magnet shaped like a bird, and it stayed there through the weeks that followed, a quiet talisman against the habit of reacting loud. The Virnai gathered in long rows that made the stars look as if they had learned to play a formal game only the very patient enjoyed, and they sent their courtesies. And Mara sent back small, practical things, flight plans and shipping advisories and requests to inspect the seals on docks they hadn't noticed yet, and sometimes a recipe for bread because ships that bake smell less like fear. And she did this without sarcasm or subtext, because the sleeper doctrine is not about lying, not really. It is about living so visibly small and competent that the gaze slides away. And it did slide, and the nightjar slipped with it, running warm but quiet, patching old pipes in stations that had given up asking to be seen. On the morning that was not morning because clocks go strange when fleets align, the nightjar found herself in the lee of a lightless moonlit no one named, a lump of iron with a blush of ice like frost on a window, and the crew went about the ritual of tea and checks, and the 5-minute silent watch that Mara kept when the air inside the ship had to remember what quiet felt like. And Lynn reported that the Virnai were testing comms on a band the Concord had forgotten to decommission, the one used by a decon program that had once reminded freighters to clean their souls, and Mara smiled because this was exactly the sort of thing that made humans strong. The habit of leaving friendly messages behind even for machines, and the habit of remembering where they had been left. And she said to Arzu, "Breathe on that channel like a window in winter." And Arzu did, and the nightjar's old decon script cleared its throat politely and told the Virnai to please scrub their boots. No one laughed aloud, because it would have been unkind even in private, but there was a gentle easing in the way bodies held themselves against gravity, and the sensors showed the smallest of stutters in the Virnai formations, a ripple no war game would have counted, which is why humans kept a separate ledger that recorded ripples and smiles and the way a tired person's eyes changed when they were offered something warm, and from that ledger the nightjar drew its courage, the kind that tasted like soup and old songs, not drums and declarations. At night, if you can call it that, when the ship ran on the minimum thrumming heartbeat, and the crew watched their monitors like people watching their sleeping children breathe, Mara walked the narrow corridors and placed her palms to the walls and asked the hull for patience, for that was the fourth movement of the sleeper doctrine. Become weather for yourself, too. Allow the storm inside you to reign and then to pass, and return to work with a floor well swept. And in this way she walked until she reached the galley where the night cook Alexei boiled water and told the kettle not to whistle because whistles were too sharp for the hour. And Mara took a cup and held it in both hands and listened to Alexei talk about small matters, how the coolant had a smell like new coins when the filters were tired, how the stars in the Perseid shelf sometimes elongated when you rubbed your eyes. And in that way the nightjar endured the approach of the Virnai without offering them the pleasure of a dramatic scene. The message that brought the first urgency came through the cold band, the one the Concord used when it wanted not to be overheard by the elegant ears of old empires. A station at Leto's Bend had gone quiet, and the vessels sent to nudge it. A wake reported feeling a kind of heavy kindness settle on their chests, which is not a sentence that belongs in a technical report, and it made the admirals write question marks against their instincts, and the nightjar received a small addendum that said, simply, "If you are near, go," which is how human orders are when written by someone who trusts you. And Mara read the line twice and told Lynn to carry them into the bay like a hand placing a cup on a saucer quietly enough not to wake anyone. Leto's Bend had once been a place where ore was counted and taxes were invented. Now it was a wheel hung between two small rocks, turning because things that are round prefer not to be still. And the first thing they found was not a weapon or a scrawl of violence, but lights dimmed to a dusk like late afternoon in a house that has decided to rest. And in that dusk figures floated slow, tethered by the care of someone who had thought ahead, and Arzu spoke to them in a voice that used the tone you use when waking a friend. "Hello, loves. It's time to come back now." And the figures did not reply. Not yet, because the thing that had come before the Virnai call it an influence. A hymn, a fog had learned to press against the parts of peoples that longed for peace, and had forgotten that peace is an action as much as an absence. And in that moment the Nightjar's crew did the old human thing, the thing learned in storms and hospital wards and long winters. They entered gently. They counted breaths. They offered hands. They told stories about small, unfinished tasks. We need your help to label these crates. And in this way the sleepers returned, because human stubbornness is most dangerous when it is tender. The Virnai had not invented the quieting fog, but they had learned to harvest it, to push it ahead of their fleets, to soften the edges of resistance like rain on chalk, and they delighted in the neatness of it, the way it made war into a lesson in manners, and it was perhaps their mistake to demonstrate it in a place where humans were observing, because humans have the habit of taking a thing apart while smiling and saying, "How lovely," and then building a new thing that looks like a recipe for stew and turns out to be a treaty enforced by thermodynamics and spite. "Will they come here next?" Lynn asked, not with fear, but with an engineer's affection for the problem. And Mara watched the vectors the way a sailor watches birds and wind, and felt in her bones the answer, yes, here, soon, like rain. And she sent her small messages out, the ones that did not carry titles or trumpets, the ones that sounded like neighbors asking if you would like to borrow a ladder, which is to say she reached for the sleeper doctrine's fifth movement. Call the others in such a way that they arrive already belonging. The Nightjar could not fight in the way admirals like, but she could make a place for fights to end in human favor, and she could prepare like an aunt who lays out quilts because she has counted how many guests will be cold by dawn. And so they began the work that looks so unmartial it is embarrassing to the young. They printed paper signs and stuck them with tape where vacuum cannot go. They practiced turning systems off in patterns that left light in the corridors that would be needed first. They wrote songs with choruses that taught procedures. They braided cords and hung them where nervous hands could hold without being empty. They placed sweets in pockets and did not count if the sweets went missing early. They boiled tea, and above all, they made a schedule that told fear when it could speak and when it had to wait, which does not silence fear so much as make it into a neighbor with whom arrangements can be made. When the Virnai arrived in their formal lines, the Nightjar did not answer with force or flourish. She answered with weather, with a small, relentless barometric pressure that you only notice when you climb a stair too quickly. And the first pass of the fog washed through the outer rings of Leto's Bend and found that the rooms had been named, and the names were already on people's tongues, which made the fog uncertain, because things you name are harder to put down. And it hesitated, and in that hesitation the Nightjar's loomers launched little courier boats that wore the rust of age like a disguise, and they laced the space between ships with handshakes and stories and instructions encoded in recipes, and the messages moved in a rhythm that did not trigger the Virnai's elegant filters, because no one had taught those filters to fear the cadence of human kitchens. The battle that followed will not sit well in academies that like their accounts crisp, because it was fought not in grand strikes but in hums and breaths and habits. And though there were duels between ships, they were quiet duels, like two old fencers testing each other's wrists in a garden where ivy has begun to take an interest in the benches, and the Virnai cut with the grace of people who have practiced cutting as a philosophy, and the human skippers, who looked like bus drivers who had simply kept driving when the road turned to water, avoided being where the cuts would be, and in the small bare pauses they spoke to each other like friends, even across nets that hissed with someone else's wind. "I am still here. I have the eastern rail. If you have sugar, add it now." And there were small explosions, of course, for not even a bedtime war is free of sparks, but the Nightjar sang through them in a voice that made the sparks sound like fireplaces, not grenades, and the crew breathed together and continued to set tables in rooms that might need them. The Virnai grew impatient in the way old empires do when villages refused to line up properly for their benefactions, and they pushed their fog harder, and the fog found the sleepers in the heart of Leto's Bend, the ones who had not been woken yet by hand and story, and it pressed kindness on them like an overwhelming blanket. And this is when the Nightjar revealed the part of the sleeper doctrine that the poets call break kindly, which does not mean destroy. It means finding the one point where a system expects grievous force and instead receiving gentle pressure at the exact angle that makes it admit its own habit of locking. And the human ships went very still, as if listening to a thought halfway formed, and then all at once the loomers pivoted on pinned trajectories and made doors where none had been planned, cutting through their own safe corridors, and pushing into shadowy arcs where the Virnai had left no monitors because no one decent goes there, and into those arcs the quiet fleet maintenance tugs with names like Sparrow and Pantry poured a flood of soft data, the kind that tastes like memory of work, a long humming of musters and roll calls, and the sound of a hand moving quickly through a bin of screws, and the fog that had been trained to follow music faltered, because this was not music in a key it knew. It was human rhythm, counting not beauty, but belonging. The Virnai flinched in etiquette rather than pain, for the power that struck them was not a blow, it was an invitation, and they had not rehearsed for being invited, and the fog thinned around the sleepers who had almost settled into forever, and the Nightjar's boarding teams, whose weapons were blankets and measures of salt, and certain small pills that reminded the heart to want its work, carried people back across thresholds they had forgotten were thresholds because they felt so comfortable. And in the press of it all, Mara kept speaking in the low voice she used when insisting gently, "Finish this list, then you may rest." And the list was always long enough to carry someone into the next hour where the next person would be waiting to offer tea. On the second day of the first Coriath Pass, when the Virnai realized that their great kind technology had been turned into a courtesy humans could decline, they reached for something sharper, and a trio of scissor ships angled toward the Nightjar, with that mature contempt reserved for a barge that refuses to be impressed by the formal garden's hedges, and Lynn cleared her throat in a way that meant now, and Mara placed her palm on the night-black helm and felt the ship as if feeling a sleeping animal's side, and she said without grandeur, "We are weather. We will be weather." And the Nightjar slipped into the scissor ships, cut the way fog moves through a trellis, not stopped by its geometry because it refuses to be a line when a cloud's curve will do, and the human crew, practicing the doctrine in their muscles, made their little motions, the 10,000 motions that keep a ship alive when the universe asks it not to bother. And the scissor ships found themselves closing on nothing, which is hard to hurt, and they passed, and did not know whether they had missed or had been missed on purpose, which is a terrible feeling for those who define victory as knowing. By evening, which is to say the watches chosen to stand for evening because the suns were far, the Virnai pulled back into their rows, disliking that they had been forced to fold without a proper coda, and the Nightjar kept the lists and kept breathing, and told the younger crew that their trembling would pass if they let it, and Mara walked again to the galley, and Alexei handed her a cup and said nothing, because the right words were already breathing in the room, and, on the comms, a soft thread played, one of the lullabies recorded as part of the list, and in the corners of sensors human markers flickered, little birds painting paths where big birds had forgotten to look. The days after were a long tide in and out, with the Virnai pressing and asking humanity to please learn to be quiet in the correct way, and humanity answering with stubborn politeness that it would be quiet but not that way. And in those days the sleeper doctrine revealed itself in dozens of small revelations, more satisfying to those who live than to those who lecture. Batteries found under floor plates where a nervous engineer had stowed them just in case 8 months before and forgotten until her hand, reaching in desperation, found the smooth cool of a cylinder, a line of maintenance drones that had been given names and a song by a bored crewman, and so came when called across static, because names and songs are leashes made of belonging, a scribbled diagram in charcoal tucked into the seam of a panel, discovered by a Virnai boarding officer who, upon reading it, paused long enough to think of his mother's kettle, and in that pause the human in front of him offered tea, and the offer, though absurd, was accepted, and nothing exploded because someone drank before the next instruction, and the instruction had time to be kind. The admirals wrote their communiques, and the Nightjar appeared in them like a smudge of thumbprint at the corner of a page that proves the page was read, and the Virnai wrote their reports, and the Nightjar did not appear in them at all, which was precisely the way the doctrine asked it to be. And through this quiet visibility, the human flotilla grew, not in hulls but in habits, until the habits themselves were a fleet, and when the Concord's heavy ships finally swung through the shelf and cut great, photogenic wounds in the Virnai formations, they did so walking through rooms humans had already opened, rooms smelling faintly of cinnamon and machine oil, and the sweat of people who worked without telling the room to admire them. It would have been enough to hold the line and pass the buckets and keep the lights on, But when the Virnai shifted their doctrine from fog to fire as a test or a tantrum, depending on who told it, there came a moment when a choice was asked of the nightjar, a question printed in gravity and intention that would later be framed by historians in bright, tidy frames. To rush to the starboard breach, where a Concord frigate with a famous name had begun to list into the wrong geometry, or to hold station at the midrail where a cluster of planetary evacuation craft, unremarkable as milk, were waiting for someone to teach them not to panic. And Mara looked at the feeds and saw the stories attached to the names, and she closed her eyes as a sailor does when the wind changes, and she chose the milk. Which is why this part of the war refuses to resolve into heroics, even in the mouths of those who love such flavors, because the nightjar saved 10,000 unremarkable people from making a fatal mistake and left the famous frigate to another savior, who arrived and did the work in a way fewer songs would be written about, and the war continued to be about continuance. The turning came not with a blaze but with a suggestion, the way a stream suggests to a stone that it move. And after 12 days of layered pressure, the Virnai ships arranged themselves in a set of harmonics that looked like a bowing, if one were sentimental. And in that bowing, they sent a message thin as a hair across thick channels. What do you call this? This refusal to be large, while being unavoidable. This quiet grammar of insistence. This polite weather that rearranges how we breathe. And Mara read it twice and passed it to Arzu and then to everyone in the galley, because the answer to a question about a people ought to be heard by the people who will live with its consequences. And they talked while stirring, which is the good place for doctrine to ripen. And after a while Mara sent back a line with no signature, as if it had come from the room itself. We call it breaking kindly, and we do it together. There was a long pause then, a whole orbit's worth of silence filled with the noises of living, and the Virnai sent a second line with an old courtesy tucked into its bones like rosemary. Will you teach us? The Admiralty above the nightjar argued for a day and a night about pride and precedent and the danger of allowing old empires to learn new weather. And while they argued, the nightjar taught in small ways because no one had told them not to, and because the act of not teaching would have been cruel, and cruelty ruins living like salt ruins a field. And so instructions went out tucked in recipes and checklists, in the way a woman might send a loaf across a fence to a neighbor with a note about oven temperatures, and the Virnai, who were not stupid even if they were proud, tried the motions, awkwardly at first, like someone learning to braid with new fingers, and, to their credit, they did not pretend elegance where there was none. By the time the Concord's heavy councils drafted their official lessons and ceremonies for exchange of doctrine, the best of the work had already been done in kitchens and engine rooms. And though the councils frowned because their speeches had been made redundant, the nightjar's crew was glad, because it meant less standing in uniforms and more making sure the right people had the right wrenches, which they would have done anyway, but it is nicer when the doing is blessed. The war did not end that day. Wars seldom obey the rhythms that would make neat stories. They drag, they scab, they itch, they return with a new name and an old shirt. But from that turning, the Virnai were less certain of their kindness and more curious about ours. And this curiosity made room for fewer fogs and more questions. And for long weeks the nightjar moved in those questions like a small boat on a big lake at dusk, oars dipping quietly, voices carrying farther than you want because the water is still. And in that dusk Mara learned that some Virnai had never baked anything, that some had never learned to cook, because to do so was to admit hunger, which their doctrine disdained, and she taught a captain named Sewell to make flatbread in a pan with oil that had seen better days, and Sewell taught Mara how to make the Virnai sign for "I will be here when you return." And these are the sorts of exchanges that make treaties live longer than signatures. There were hard days afterward, too, because empires resent learning humility, and humans resent being asked for more patience than they have, and fights broke out over small things stood for large things, like the proper temperature for tea, or the proper way to declare you are tired in a way that does not make you look weak. And there were moments when the nightjar's crew felt used, and moments when Virnai officers felt mocked, and in those moments the doctrine asked them to become weather for each other. And sometimes they remembered, and sometimes they failed and apologized. And the apologies were written down next to the victories, Because in human bookkeeping, it turns out that apologies count as infrastructure. One evening, half a year after Leto's Bend, and 3 days after a skirmish that no one could agree whether to call a battle, the nightjar hung over a strip of dust where the arm of the galaxy throws stones into the dark, and the comms lit with a signal that did not carry a name, only a tone, and after a long minute the tone resolved into words that came from nowhere and everywhere, as signals do when they have taken long routes through old cables and new mines, and the words asked the most neighborly of questions. "Are you awake?" Arzu looked at Mara, and Mara looked at the kettle, and the kettle began to whisper, because even metal follows certain stories. And Mara said, "We are," and waited, "because this is how you answer a question at your door at dusk." And the voice said, "We have counted your weather and would like to speak of roofs." And Lin smiled at the way empires, when forced to ask small, stumble, and the nightjar set her small oars and moved toward the voice through quiet space. And the crew made room at tables, not because they knew whether the voice was friend or old foe wearing new clothes, but because the doctrine they had lived made the question itself a kind of peace. "Are you awake?" "Yes, we are." "Come in. Bring your wet coat. We'll find a hook."